The rain poured mercilessly from the darkening Montana sky as Faith O'Malley sat alone on the wooden steps of the abandoned church. Her white wedding gown soaked and mudded, tears streaming down her face indistinguishable from the raindrops that pelted her pale skin. It was May of 1879, and what should have been the happiest day of her 20-year-old life had shattered into pieces when her groom failed to appear at the altar, leaving her to face the sympathetic, and then gradually disappearing crowd of townsfolk who had gathered to witness their union. Faith had been sitting there for nearly an hour, refusing to accept the reality of her situation, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the drumming rain. She didn't bother to look up, assuming it was her father or brother coming to collect her and take her back to their ranch, where she would have to face the pitying looks from her family and the knowledge that she'd been abandoned. The hoofbeats stopped, but no voice called out to her. Instead, she felt the rain suddenly cease hitting her head and shoulders, though she could still hear it pattering around her. Confused, Faith lifted her gaze to find a weathered brown cowboy hat hovering above her, held by a strong, tanned hand. Her eyes traveled up to meet the concerned blue eyes of a man she'd seen around Copper Creek but had never formally met. "Miss, you'll catch your death out here," the stranger said, his voice deep and gentle. "My name's Henry Owens. May I escort you somewhere dry?" Faith stared at him, taking in his tall frame, the rain now soaking his light brown hair since he'd removed his hat to shelter her. His clothes were travel-worn but clean, and there was a kindness in his expression that made her heart stir, despite her current heartbreak. "There's nowhere to go," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thomas isn't coming," Henry nodded solemnly. "I heard tell in town. I'm mighty sorry for what happened to you, miss." Faith O'Malley," she replied automatically, then added bitterly, "Still O'Malley, it seems." Henry knelt down beside her, keeping his hat held over her head even as the rain drenched him. "Miss O'Malley, I can't fix what's happened today, but I can at least get you out of this rain. Would you allow me to take you home?" Something in his earnest expression broke through Faith's numbness. She nodded slowly and allowed him to help her to her feet, the sodden white gown weighing heavily around her legs. Henry guided her to his horse, a sturdy Palomino gelding that stood patiently in the downpour. With gentle hands, he helped her mount, then swung up behind her. Before urging the horse forward, he carefully placed his hat on her head. "I don't need your hat, Mr. Owens. You're getting soaked," Faith protested weakly. "A gentleman doesn't let a lady get wet while he stays dry," Henry replied simply, wrapping his duster around her shoulders as best he could before taking the reins. "Now, where can I take you, Miss O'Malley?" Faith hesitated. The thought of facing her family, of seeing the disappointment in her father's eyes and the fury in her brother's, was unbearable. I don't want to go home just yet," she admitted. "Is there somewhere else we could go, just until I compose myself?" Henry considered this request for a moment before nodding. "My sister runs a boarding house at the edge of town. She'd be happy to give you a place to dry off and gather your thoughts." As they rode through the rain-slick streets of Copper Creek, Faith became acutely aware of the strong chest pressed against her back, and the protective way Henry's arms encircled her as he held the reins. She'd never been this close to a man other than Thomas, and the comforting warmth of Henry's presence began to thaw the icy shock that had frozen her heart. The boarding house was a tidy 2-story building with a wide porch and curtained windows glowing with welcoming light. As they approached, a woman with the same blue eyes as Henry appeared at the door, her expression changing from curiosity to concern when she spotted Faith's bedraggled wedding dress. "Hank, what on earth?" she began, but Henry cut her off with a gentle shake of his head. "Maggie, this is Miss Faith O'Malley. She needs a dry place and some privacy for a spell. Miss O'Malley, this is my sister, Margaret Owens." Understanding dawned on Margaret's face. "Oh, you poor dear. Come in, come in. I'll draw you a hot bath and find you some dry clothes." Faith allowed herself to be led inside, gratitude washing over her as Margaret fussed and clucked, leading her upstairs to a clean, simple room with a brass bed and flowered wallpaper. True to her word, Margaret soon had a steaming bath prepared in an adjoining washroom and provided Faith with a simple calico dress that was only slightly too large. "It's mine, but it should do for now," Margaret explained. "I'll bring you some hot tea when you're dressed. Take all the time you need." Left alone, Faith sank into the hot water, letting the warmth penetrate her chilled bones. As she scrubbed away the mud and rain, she also tried to wash away the humiliation of the day. Thomas Patterson had seemed so sure, so committed to their future together. They'd been courting for nearly a year, and his proposal had been everything she'd dreamed of. What had changed? Why had he abandoned her at the altar without so much as a note of explanation? By the time she emerged from the bath and dressed in Margaret's borrowed clothes, Faith felt marginally better, at least physically. Her heart still ached, but the paralyzing shock had subsided into a dull throb of pain and confusion. When she descended the stairs, she found Henry sitting at a small table in the kitchen, his hair still damp but wearing dry clothes. He stood immediately when she entered. "Miss O'Malley, I hope you're feeling a bit better," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Faith managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Owens. Your kindness, both yours and your sister's, means more than I can express." Margaret appeared with a tray bearing a teapot, cups, and a plate of biscuits. "Sit and eat something, dear. Food helps in times of trouble, my mother always said." As Faith sipped her tea, Henry explained that he worked as a cattle driver for the Diamond Bar Ranch outside of town and had just returned from delivering a herd to the railroad at Helena. "I was riding back through town when I passed the church and saw you sitting there," he said. "Couldn't rightly pass by without offering help." "Most would have," Faith said quietly. "Most did." Henry's expression hardened slightly. "Then they weren't raised proper. My pa always taught us that you don't turn your back on someone in need." There was something so straightforward and decent about the way he said it that Faith felt tears threatening again. She blinked them back, determined not to break down in front of these kind strangers who had already done so much. "I should let my family know where I am," she said reluctantly. "They'll be worried." "I'll ride out and tell them," Henry offered immediately. "Just give me directions to your place." After Henry departed for the O'Malley Ranch, Margaret insisted that Faith eat a proper meal and then showed her to a small sitting room with a bookshelf and comfortable chairs. "Rest here, dear. Read if you like. Nobody will disturb you." Left alone, Faith found herself drawn to the window, watching the rain continue to fall as dusk settled over Copper Creek. Her thoughts turned to Henry Owens, his gentle manner, the way he'd instantly offered his hat as protection against the rain, how he hadn't pressed her with questions or unwanted advice. In the midst of the worst day of her life, this stranger had shown her more kindness than she could have expected. It was nearly 2 hours later when Henry returned, accompanied by Faith's mother, Rebecca O'Malley, who rushed to embrace her daughter with tears in her eyes. "Oh, my darling girl," Rebecca murmured, holding Faith tightly. "I've been so worried. Your father and brothers have been searching all over town." "I'm sorry, Mama," Faith whispered. "I couldn't face everyone just yet." Rebecca pulled back to look at her daughter, gently tucking a strand of hair behind Faith's ear. "No need to apologize. That worthless Patterson boy is the one who should be sorry if your brothers find him." She left the threat unspoken. Henry cleared his throat discreetly. "Mrs. O'Malley, Miss Faith is welcome to stay here tonight if she wishes. My sister has already prepared a room." Rebecca looked between Henry and Faith, her expression softening. "That's very kind, Mr. Owens. Perhaps it would be best for Faith to have a quiet night away from home." She turned back to Faith. "Would you prefer that, dear?" Faith nodded, relief washing over her. "Just for tonight, Mama. I'll come home tomorrow." After Rebecca departed with promises to return in the morning with fresh clothes, Faith found herself once again sitting across from Henry at the kitchen table. Margaret had tactfully retired to her room, leaving them alone. "Thank you for fetching my mother," Faith said. "And for not telling the whole town where to find me." Henry smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "No need for thanks, I just did what any decent fellow would do." "No," Faith shook her head firmly, "not any man would have stopped. Not any man would have given me his hat and brought me somewhere safe." She paused, gathering her courage. "May I ask why you were riding past the church today? It's not on the direct route from Helena." Henry looked slightly embarrassed. "Truth is, I heard in town this morning that Thomas Patterson had been seen boarding the eastbound train at dawn. There was talk about a wedding canceled. I didn't know it was yours, but I thought I might ride by the church, just to see if anyone needed help." He shrugged. "Just seemed like the right thing to do." Faith studied him, wondering at the kind of man who would deliberately go looking for someone in trouble just to offer assistance. "You're a good man, Henry Owens." Henry's cheeks reddened slightly at the compliment. "Just doing what my pa taught me." They fell into conversation easily after that. Henry told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, losing both parents to influenza 10 years ago when he was 19, and heading west with his sister, the only family he had left. Faith shared stories of her childhood on the O'Malley Ranch, her 4 older brothers who alternated between tormenting and protecting her, and her dreams of someday having a place of her own. Neither mentioned Thomas Patterson or the wedding that wasn't, and Faith was grateful for that. For a few hours, she almost forgot the day's heartbreak, caught up in Henry's tales of cattle drives and the beautiful landscapes he'd seen in his travels. When Faith finally retired to the guest room, she found herself thinking not of Thomas and his betrayal, but of Henry's kind blue eyes and the way his hat had smelled of sunshine and horses when he'd placed it on her head. The next morning, Faith's mother arrived with fresh clothes and news that Thomas Patterson had left a letter with the preacher explaining that he'd received word of a lucrative business opportunity in Chicago and couldn't pass it up. He'd apologized for the inconvenience and wished Faith well. "Inconvenience," Faith repeated hollowly, sitting on the edge of the bed while her mother unpacked the clothes she'd brought. "As if he'd merely been late for supper, not abandoned me at the altar." Rebecca squeezed her daughter's hand. "He's shown his true nature, Faith. A man who would do such a thing isn't worthy of you." Faith nodded, knowing her mother was right but still struggling with the humiliation and pain. "Everyone in town will be talking about it. Poor Faith O'Malley left at the altar." "Let them talk," Rebecca said firmly. "You hold your head high. You've done nothing wrong." When they descended the stairs, they found Henry preparing to leave. He was dressed in his working clothes, his recovered hat now dry and shaped back to its proper form. "I've got to get back to the Diamond Bar," he explained. The boss doesn't take kindly to extended absences. Faith felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "Of course. You've already done far more than necessary, Mr. Owens." Henry fidgeted with the brim of his hat. "Miss Faith, if you ever need anything at all, you can find me at the Diamond Bar or leave word with Maggie here." "Thank you, Mr. Owens," Faith said softly, "for everything." As he mounted his horse, Henry turned back to her with a gentle smile. "I hope things get easier for you, Miss Faith. You deserve happiness." With that, he tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Faith with an odd feeling of loss, as if something important was riding away with him. The following weeks were as difficult as Faith had feared. Though her family rallied around her, protecting her from the worst of the town's gossip, she couldn't escape the pitying looks and hushed conversations that stopped whenever she entered a shop or walked down the street. Thomas Patterson was gone, but his betrayal lingered in every sympathetic glance and awkward interaction. Faith threw herself into work on the ranch, helping with the spring calving and taking on additional chores to keep her mind and hands busy. She avoided town when possible and declined invitations to social gatherings, preferring the company of her family and the honest labor of ranch life. It was nearly a month after the wedding that wasn't when Faith encountered Henry Owens again. She had finally ventured into town alone to pick up supplies at the general store, steeling herself for the inevitable whispers and stares. As she was loading her purchases into the family wagon, a familiar voice called her name, Miss Faith. She turned to find Henry approaching, looking slightly hesitant. The sight of him brought an unexpected rush of warmth to her chest. Mr. Owens, she greeted him with a genuine smile, the first she'd given anyone outside her family in weeks. How are you? I'm well, thank you, he replied, stepping forward to help her with a heavy sack of flour. And you, are you doing all right? Faith appreciated that he didn't tiptoe around the subject or pretend not to know why she might not be all right. Some days are better than others, she answered honestly, but I'm surviving. Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes. I've thought about you often, wondered how you were faring. Have you? Faith felt a flutter in her stomach at his admission. I have, he confirmed, his expression earnest. In fact, I was hoping I might call on you sometime if that wouldn't be unwelcome. Faith stared at him in surprise. Call on me, like courting? Henry's cheeks reddened, but he didn't look away. Yes, madam, like courting, though I understand if it's too soon or if you're not interested. Faith considered his request, studying the man before her. Henry Owens wasn't handsome in the conventional way Thomas had been. Where Thomas had smooth hands and fancy clothes, Henry had calloused palms and practical garments worn with honest work. Where Thomas had charmed with clever words and grand promises, Henry spoke plainly and had shown his character through actions rather than declarations. It might be too soon for the town's liking, Faith said slowly, but I find I don't much care what the town thinks anymore. She smiled up at him. I would welcome your call, Mr. Owens. The smile that lit Henry's face made Faith's heart skip. Sunday afternoon, I could come by your family's ranch, properly introduce myself to your father. Sunday would be perfect, Faith agreed, suddenly looking forward to the weekend in a way she hadn't anticipated. True to his word, Henry arrived at the O'Malley ranch on Sunday afternoon, dressed in his best clothes, hair neatly combed, and bearing a small bouquet of wildflowers for Faith. He met her father, Michael O'Malley, with a firm handshake and direct gaze, answering the older man's questions about his background and intentions with straightforward honesty. I respect your daughter, sir, Henry said when Michael asked why he was interested in courting Faith. She's shown remarkable strength and dignity in difficult circumstances. I'd like the chance to know her better. Michael studied the young man thoughtfully before giving a curt nod. You seem decent enough, Owens, but you should know my girl's been through enough. I won't have her heart broken again. Neither would I, sir, Henry responded seriously. That's not my intention. With Michael's grudging approval, Henry and Faith began a careful courtship. They started with chaperoned visits at the O'Malley home, progressing to buggy rides through the countryside, and occasional dinners at Margaret's boarding house. Unlike her whirlwind romance with Thomas, which had been full of grand gestures and passionate declarations, Faith's relationship with Henry grew slowly, built on conversations about meaningful things, their hopes, fears, beliefs, and dreams. She learned that he was saving to buy his own small ranch someday, that he loved poetry but was embarrassed to admit it to other cowboys, that he still missed his parents but had found peace in the memory of what they'd taught him. In turn, Faith shared her love of teaching children at the Sunday school, her secret ambition to someday write stories for publication, and her fears that she might never fully trust a man's promises again after Thomas's betrayal. I can't promise I'll never disappoint you, Henry told her one evening as they sat on the O'Malley's front porch, her mother discreetly watching from the window. But I can promise I'll never lie to you or abandon you. If I make a vow to you, Faith O'Malley, I'll keep it or die trying. There was such quiet certainty in his voice that Faith found herself believing him, despite her wounded heart's hesitation. Summer passed into autumn, and as the leaves began to turn, Faith realized that the pain of Thomas's betrayal had faded to a dull memory, overshadowed by the growing feelings she had for Henry. Where once she had dreamed of a life with Thomas, now she found herself imagining a future with Henry, a small ranch of their own, children with his blue eyes and steady nature, evenings spent reading together by the fire. The town's gossip had gradually shifted from pitying the abandoned bride to speculating about the surprising match between Faith O'Malley and the quiet cowboy from the Diamond Bar. Some whispered that she was merely seeking a replacement for Thomas, while others suggested that Henry was simply kind-hearted enough to take on damaged goods. Faith tried not to let such talk bother her, but occasionally the cruel words would find their target. One such day, after overhearing two women in the mercantile discussing how Henry must feel being second choice, Faith found herself fighting tears as she hurried back to her wagon. She was so distracted that she nearly collided with a man turning the corner. Looking up with an apology ready, she froze when she recognized Thomas Patterson standing before her, dressed in a fine suit and looking prosperous but uncomfortable. "Faith," he said, removing his hat. "I hoped I might see you while I was in town." Faith stared at him, her heart pounding not with longing but with indignation. "Thomas, what are you doing back in Copper Creek?" he shifted awkwardly. "Business primarily, but I also wanted to see you to explain properly about what happened." "You explained quite adequately in your letter," Faith replied coolly. "A business opportunity that couldn't wait, as I recall." Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. "I know my behavior was inexcusable. I panicked, Faith. The responsibility of marriage, of providing for a family I wasn't ready. I've regretted how I handled things ever since." "But not that you left," Faith noted. He hesitated. "I wasn't ready then, but I've established myself now. I have a successful business connections. I've grown up." He stepped closer. "I've missed you, Faith. I was hoping perhaps you might consider giving us another chance." Faith was so astonished she nearly laughed. "Another chance? You abandoned me at the altar, Thomas. You humiliated me in front of the entire town, and now you think you can just return and pick up where we left off." "I know it's a lot to ask," Thomas admitted, "but we had something special once. Don't you remember how good it was between us?" Before Faith could respond, a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see Henry approaching, concern evident on his face. "Faith, everything all right?" he asked, coming to stand beside her, his presence reassuring. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he looked between them. "I see, so the rumors are true. You've found someone else." "Yes," Faith said simply, slipping her hand into Henry's. "I have." Henry squeezed her hand gently, his expression neutral but his eyes watchful as he assessed the situation. Thomas forced a smile. "Well, I wish you both happiness." He placed his hat back on his head. "If you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." As Thomas walked away, Faith felt a strange sense of closure. The man she had once thought she would spend her life with was now just a stranger in a fancy suit, while the man beside her, in his worn work clothes and scuffed boots, had become the one she couldn't imagine living without. "Was that him?" Henry asked quietly once Thomas was out of earshot. Faith nodded. "He wanted me back." Henry's hand tightened briefly around hers before he consciously relaxed his grip. "And what did you tell him?" Faith turned to face Henry fully, seeing the carefully concealed worry in his eyes. "I told him I'd found someone else, someone better, someone true." The worry in Henry's eyes dissolved, replaced by a warmth that made Faith's heart swell. Without caring who might be watching in the busy street, he leaned down and kissed her gently. "I love you, Faith O'Malley," he said when they parted. "I think I started falling for you that rainy day when you were sitting on those church steps, so beautiful and so brave even in your heartbreak." Faith smiled up at him, her own heart full to bursting. "And I love you, Henry Owens, not because you rescued me or because you were kind when I needed kindness, but because you've shown me every day since what a good man truly is." 2 weeks later, Henry proposed properly, going down on one knee in the meadow where they often rode together, offering a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. "It's not fancy," he apologized, "but it was given with great love and I'd be honored if you'd wear it." "It's perfect," Faith assured him, holding out her trembling hand for him to slip the ring onto her finger. "Absolutely perfect." They were married the following spring in a simple ceremony at the O'Malley Ranch. Faith wore a dress of pale blue rather than white, and when it began to sprinkle rain just as they exchanged vows, she laughed with pure joy. "It's good luck," she told Henry when he looked concerned about her getting wet. "The rain brought us together after all." Still, as they stood under the suddenly showering sky, Henry removed his hat and held it over her head, just as he had done nearly a year before, protecting her from the rain while getting soaked himself. This time, Faith reached up and took the hat from him, setting it aside. "No need for that any more," she said softly, standing on tiptoe to kiss him as the rain fell around them. "I'm not just taking shelter under your hat now, I'm taking your name. We'll weather whatever comes together." And as they kissed, sealing their vows with the spring rain blessing their union, Faith knew that what had begun as the worst day of her life had set her on the path to finding the greatest happiness she could have imagined, not with a man who made grand promises, but with one who kept the simple ones. Over the next few years, Faith and Henry worked side by side to build their dream. With the money Henry had saved and a small inheritance Faith received from her grandmother, they purchased a modest spread adjacent to the O'Malley ranch. The land was promising but neglected, the cabin in need of substantial repairs. But they tackled each challenge together, turning the property into a viable cattle operation they named Rainy Day Ranch, a private joke between them about how they'd met. Their first child, a daughter they named Rebecca after Faith's mother, arrived a year after their wedding, followed 2 years later by a son they called Michael, honoring Faith's father. Margaret moved from her boarding house in town to a small cottage Henry built on their property, becoming an indispensable aunt to the children and helper to Faith, especially during the busy calving seasons or when Henry had to be away on cattle drives. Faith eventually did pursue her dream of writing, penning stories for the local newspaper, and even having a few tales published in magazines back east. Henry proudly displayed each publication in a special shelf he built in their parlor, boasting about his talented wife to anyone who would listen. Thomas Patterson's business ventures eventually failed, and he left Montana for good, hardly remembered by the townsfolk who had once considered him Copper Creek's most eligible bachelor. Occasionally, someone would mention the wedding that never happened, but such references were usually met with puzzled looks from newcomers who only knew Faith as Mrs. Henry Owens, half of one of the most respected ranching couples in the county. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Henry surprised Faith with a special gift, a new hat custom-made from the finest materials, with her initials discreetly stamped inside the band. "What's this for?" Faith asked, turning the beautiful hat in her hands. Henry smiled, the same gentle smile that had warmed her heart that rainy day long ago. "Well, Mrs. Owens, I figured after 10 years of sharing my name you ought to have a proper hat of your own as well." Faith laughed and kissed him, as much in love as the day they'd wed. "Henry Owens, you are still the kindest man I've ever known." "And you," he replied, gathering her close, "are still the most beautiful bride I ever saw, sitting alone in the rain." As night fell over Rainy Day Ranch, Faith reflected on how a heartbreak had led her to true love, and how a simple act of kindness, a cowboy covering a rain-soaked bride with his hat, had changed her life forever. The path hadn't always been easy, but it had led her exactly where she was meant to be. In the arms of a good man, surrounded by the family they'd built together, sheltered not just by his hat, but by his enduring love.